Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our monthly webinar series, Conversations on Character and the Common Good. This series is part of Virtues and Vocations, a national forum housed at the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame and supported by the Kern Family Foundation. I am Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Center for Social Concerns, and I'm the host of this series. Virtues and Vocations seeks to foster a community of practice among scholars and practitioners across disciplines who are keen to understand how best to cultivate character and moral purpose in higher education and the professions. This webinar series is one way we facilitate these conversations. Our conversation will run up till about 12:40, then we'll open it up for your questions. You can submit a question anytime through the Q&A mechanism, and I'll pose them directly. And with that, and without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest for today's conversation, Parker Palmer, who's joining us today to talk with us on education and vocation. Parker J. Palmer is a writer, speaker, and activist who focuses on issues in education, community, leadership, spirituality, and social change. He is founder of the Center for Courage and Renewal. And certainly, as close to a household name as he is, I'm going to be very brief on some critical Vita points. He holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California at Berkeley. He is author of 10 books, including several award-winning titles that have sold nearly 2 million copies and have been translated into 10 different languages. He has received 13 honorary doctorates, 2 Distinguished Achievement Awards from the National Education Press Association, an Award of Excellence from the Associated Church Press. Certainly very accomplished. Welcome, Palmer.
Hi, Suzanne. Good to be with you.
Great. So I'm hoping in today's conversation, we can focus really on teaching as a vocation, but also talk a little bit about democracy given the moment in time we're in. But I usually like to open it up a little more informally to get a better sense of your journey. Does that sound okay?
You bet.
Great. So I'm hoping you could actually describe for us a typical day for you. As someone who's pretty much a household name, I know that I often imagine you don't do things like eat breakfast. So if you could just talk about what your day looks like and sort of what are the highlights of such a day?
Well, I'm married to a woman who insists that I eat breakfast, so that's not a problem. And she fixes wonderful oatmeal, and since I'm a Quaker, it all works, the oatmeal and the religion. So a typical day for me right now is at age 85 is very different from typical days in past decades. For many years, 40 years, I worked independently as a writer and a traveling teacher. So I spent half my time at home at the keyboard and the other half on the road doing talks, workshops, retreats, consulting jobs, and so forth. COVID, of course, shut down the traveling, and I learned over those few years of shutdown that I didn't miss airplanes at all. And so I was able to work out more of my solitary side, which has always been part of my writing life, for which I'm deeply grateful. And these days, am mostly at home in Madison, Wisconsin, which fortunately is a lovely place to do all kinds of outdoor stuff. I love the woods. I love big nature. Life in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota has been a staple for me for many years in the late summer. And I continue to write. My publisher is coming out with new editions of 4 of my books this year, 2024. So I'm writing new material for all of them. I'm actively engaged with the work of the Center for Courage and Renewal, which now has something like 250 facilitators around the world doing Circle of Trust retreats, which I wrote about in a book called The Hidden Wholeness. And I urge folks to check out the work of the Center for Courage and Renewal. So lots is happening, and I'm a grandfather and a dad and all of those good things. And yes, I do eat breakfast.
Well, good to know. Thanks so much. You talked about sort of now you're doing more writing, and that's a more significant part of daily life. Are you someone who finds joy in writing, or is writing something stressful for you? Many academics sort of have a good deal of angst around writing.
Yeah, well, such an interesting question, Suzanne, because I have to say both. Um, I I live a life of paradoxes, and that's one of them. Writing feels imperative to me. I don't know how I would have made it through 60 plus years of adult life if I didn't have a regular habit of writing, which, as I suggested earlier, involves solitude, it involves reflection. In my case, it's less about going to the library and digging up scholarship and creating footnotes, and it's more about mining my own experience of life in the various roles that I've played as teacher, which always means learner as well, as activist, as a member of a civic community and a family and a neighborhood. All of these things have been the sources of my writing, but writing itself, while I must do it, and I do it every day with great regularity, is very demanding for me. I've often said I'm not so much a writer as I am a rewriter. And I really don't think that any of my books were published short of a sixth, seventh, or eighth draft. Um, Fortunately, I guess I have some kind of shut-off mechanism which says, okay, enough is enough. So you have to get along with real life. So send this to the publisher and let's see what happens.
Great, thanks for that. So you mentioned you're coming out with new editions of several books, and I wonder if you can take that 60-year plus journey as an adult and talk about the important moments of it. You are a very self-reflective person, and certainly in your 2008 volume, On the Brink of Everything, you did quite a bit of this, but I wonder if you imagine it as critical moments or as the greatest hits of Parker Palmer. Are there hits that you regret, that you would redo? Yeah, if you could just talk about it in whatever ways you break that up. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking of Taylor Swift. I have sort of teenage daughters who were obsessed with her recent Eras tour. So I wonder if, in a Taylor Swift-esque way, there is the eras of Parker Palmer.
Well, thank you, but I'm not going to even try to compete with Taylor Swift. I understand I'm up against cosmic odds with her, so I won't go there. But along the lines of the name of your program, of your enterprise, Virtues and Vocations, I have been thinking recently about a particular moment that in my journey when I was in my 20s, which may connect in some way to the students you work with at Notre Dame and some who may be listening here. I was the first person in my family to go to college, and I never really imagined having an academic career or a career as a writer or a public intellectual or whatever people call folks like that. But I ended up having graduated from Carleton College in Minnesota, which was a lucky place for me to be. I met some great mentors there. Um, I ended up going to the University of California at Berkeley in the mid-60s for a PhD in sociology. And just naming the mid-60s, I think, gives most people a sense of what was going on at that time and some of the sort of history I observed and even participated in small parts of. A lot was happening at Berkeley in the 60s. I was working very hard to get a PhD uh, as this first step in an academic career, thinking I'd end up as a professor somewhere. But what was happening was so compelling to me, as was the student movement of the time. And among the things that were happening, Vietnam, the rise of the women's movement, the rise of the Black Panthers, and at least two avenues of work around Black liberation, the civil rights movement, and a movement that was arguably more aggressive than that. There was the burning of American cities. And by the time I finished my PhD in 1969, I had come to feel deeply called to the urban crisis of that era. Yet another era like our own, when America was attempting to reckon with its original sin of white supremacy and systemic racism. So the calling was so heartfelt, so deep, so profound that I walked away from academia when I was 29 years old and became a community organizer in Washington, D.C. Quick tour is that I spent the next 5 years doing that work. I then took what I thought was a sabbatical year to go to a Quaker community adult study center called Pendle Hill to learn more about nonviolent social change. And thinking I'd come back to my community organizing at the end of that sabbatical year. But what happened was that I found myself so drawn to communal life, Quaker style, that I stayed at Pendle Hill for the next 11 years, working there as Dean of Studies and writer in residence. The point I'd like to make without getting into the weeds about all that happened during that 15, 16-year period is that the people around me, my family, my mentors, my colleagues and friends were basically asking, what in God's name are you doing with yourself? You prepared for an academic career. You put a lot of time and energy into getting a PhD, and now you're walking away from all that to do things that are basically off the radar of course, what they meant of people like us, my friends and colleagues and family. What's that all about? And I'll tell you how I responded, because maybe that's something you would want to inquire into a little further. I always said to people back in the day, and I'll say it to this day, what am I doing? I can't fully explain it even to myself, because it's full of professional risks, it's full of economic risks, it's full of stresses and strains of many sorts. All I know is that I can't not do it. I can't not do it. Those are the precise words in which it came to me. So when I talk with young people these days, partly around my book, Let Your Life Speak, which draws quite a few conversations my way, after I've listened for a long time and we've had a chance to get to know each other, I will ask, is there anything that you can't not do? Because if so, let's talk about that. There may be clues in there. More recently, I think, Suzanne, I've come to understand that phrase, I can't not do it, as a way of saying, I feel a soulful imperative. it feels that's in some way that my soul is at risk, that if I don't pursue this quite alternative track, if I don't go down this path off the beaten path, I'm going to pay a soul price somewhere down the road. I will have somehow betrayed my own truth, a truth that for me emerged in response to what was going on in the world around me. So it wasn't just an internal impulse. It was an effort to be responsible, to exercise the ability to respond to the environment in which I was living at the time. And of course, we're living in not dissimilar times today, sort of on steroids.
Yeah, so I would like to pull this apart a little bit more. I have a colleague here, Felicia Johnson O'Brien, who teaches a discernment class for seniors and uses your Let Your Life Speak book. And I wonder in that, because I've often myself reflected on it, and sometimes I think, um, can I trust what my life is saying? Um, and how do I know that's what it's saying, right? That how can I hear it beyond all the other things I'm hearing and the barrage of noise? And so, how does one actually do that well, if you will? And then the second is um, people talk all the time about how much students have changed and social media, the different stresses post COVID. And I would love you also to reflect on your engagement as you talk to young people, if the same kinds of methodologies and strategies and modes of reflection are still work today that work for you, because I'm really taken by your analogy to this moment in the 60s to the contemporary moment and a
Mm-hmm.
sense of historical continuity that I think we sometimes forget. So a little bit of both. So how do you trust what your life is telling you?
Yeah, let's start there and then help me remember to talk about the current generation and as I experience them. So, first of all, you're absolutely right when you imply that we have a lot of different kinds of voices, not only around us, but within us, right? I believe that we have the voice of an inner teacher, we have the voice of truth, we have all of that guiding light that we should be following. But I also know from my own experience of myself that we have voices of greed, of ego, of power hungriness, of resentment, of anger, um, voices with which you don't want to ignore or pretend you don't have. That would be exactly the wrong thing to do, because ignoring them gives them more power over you. You know, the unexamined life is not worth living, said Socrates, and this is an example of why. You've got to look at that anger, you've got to look at that greed, and you've got to understand where it's coming from, lest it run your life, control your life. Um, but and so sorting all that mix out, what am I hearing from within that's trustworthy, is critical. And to me, another paradox in life has always been, even back in the day at age 29, that I needed to hold this solitary reflection and inquiry into what I'm hearing from within in creative tension with communities of discernment, communities that you can't find in the yellow pages, communities that don't just pop up like mushrooms. You have to help create them. You have to gather people who understand that their role with you in this moment of discernment is not to tell you what to do, because everybody in my life at that time would have said, for God's sake, go get an academic job and get on a promotion ladder and get some security, and you have a young family and so forth. Um, but instead, to gather with people who know how to ask honest, open questions, to help hear you into deeper speech, to help you sort and sift and winnow uh, what's happening inside to the place where you can achieve some reasonable degree of certainty that you're listening to your best lights and not to your lesser self. It takes time, and it's a spiritual discipline, it's a psychological discipline, it's a communal uh, social discipline to serve each other around discernment in the way I'm proposing. And again, I'll just flag something here that I learned a lot about this at Pendle Hill, the Quaker Study Center, where I spent 11 years after my stint as a community organizer. This is essentially Quaker bread and butter, what they call a clearness committee, with the particular spiritual disciplines that surround helping a person do that kind of discernment, that sorting and sifting and winnowing. You asked, does that work with the younger generation? And the answer is that I don't have enough 2024 experience of the younger generation, or even 2023, except for some family members who are in their late 20s and early 30s with whom I am in frequent contact and learn things about what it means to be in that generation. But the last time, maybe 10 years ago, that I was a visiting professor for a year at a college, I taught a course for seniors called Where Do I Go From Here? Because I've always felt that one of the big faults in higher education is we get students out on the high dive board and call them graduated, and then let them jump into the deep end all by themselves without a vocational preparation and reflection where they might learn some of these tools and develop some of these disciplines. So I taught this course, I've taught it twice now, and I used this discernment process that I was describing. I taught it to them, and they went off and did it for themselves and by themselves, because there's confidentiality involved in this kind of work. And their self-reports were that it was a fabulous experience, the likes of which they had never had. I mean, typically when we go to other people with a problem, they'll give us maybe 5 minutes of listening, maybe 7 minutes if they've been to a listening workshop recently. And then they'll start telling us what they would do if they had our problem. And I've always found that kind of advice profoundly unhelpful. It's always left me unheard and unseen. But with this process where you ask honest, open questions, you discipline yourself to do no fixing, no saving, no correcting each other, no advising each other. Something different happens, and a person is allowed and abled to have a deepening conversation with herself or himself. I wouldn't have known how to make my way through this twisting vocational path I've been on, which incidentally didn't cohere for me until I was 50. So I always tell 22-year-olds, you got a lot of time to work this out. Forget about all those questions of what are you going to do? What are you going to do with your life? You won't know that until you're 50, if you're anything like me. So I'll lay this down now, but let me put one more big frame on it, just very briefly. This has been a very useful frame for me that's been with me for a long time. Gandhi entitled his autobiography, My Experiments with Truth. And as soon as I saw that, I loved it. I thought, yeah, that's a a viable description of how to live a life as a series of experiments with truth. Truth, your own truth, the truth of the world, the truth about where you intersect the world most creatively, most fruitfully. Truth is a very complicated thing, and to approach it experimentally, to say, okay, I'm going to try this, and if I can't try it as my full-time job, I can try it as an avocation. I can try it as a hobby. I can try it as a sideline or a side gig. And I'm going to see how it makes me feel. And do I feel more alive? Do I feel more engaged? Do I feel more like me? I mean, I think that's the litmus test that we're all looking for as we search for how to be at home in our own skins for as long as we can while we're on the face of the earth, and how to be at home on the face of a very diverse earth, which seems to be a big issue for a lot of people these days.
I really like the allusion to Gandhi and this notion of experiments, because you've described your own trajectory as somewhat meandering and full of paradox. Eh, Are there, as you reflect on your own path, what enables you to sort of move through the transitions, right? The different transitions. So you found your vocation at 50. Um, but for someone who's 22, 50 seems like 1,000 years away. Um, and that you've described your life as an unfolding. How do you navigate um, the different versions of self as they unfold? I don't know if that makes full sense, but yeah,
Yeah.
how do you deal with the moments of doubt, the change of context, those sorts of things?
Yeah, I think just quickly of Mary Catherine Bateson and composing a life, and not just once, but many times we're called upon to compose a life. And I certainly resonate with your notion that for a 22-year-old, 50 is like living on Mars, it's sort of unimaginable. Um, eh, um, which is bad news from their subjective point of view, but in fact it's good news because it means that nobody gets stuff totally worked out at age 22. I defy you to show me someone who at age 40 or 50 or 60 or 70 or 80 or 90 will say, yeah, it's all played out exactly as I thought it would when I was 22 years old. That just doesn't happen. And so I think part of what has to happen for young people, and it can happen at colleges and universities, it should happen at colleges and universities, they should be surrounded by adults who tell the truth about themselves and don't pretend that where they are today is where they always imagined being, and that it's been a totally smooth road free of potholes from when they were 22 to where they are today. I think young people get a lot of exhortation from older folks. Like, now, if you work hard, you'll know someday you'll be just like me. Well, you know, I mean, there's part of me that laughs at that because uh, um, I've suffered being me long enough to know that I don't want to wish that on anybody else, right? so, so that's kind of silly in and of itself. But every older person knows that, yeah, hard work is required, but it doesn't always win the day. A lot of dumb luck is involved. A lot of experimentation is involved. A lot of stops and starts, successes and failures. It's the whole mix. I remember once having, and I'm dwelling on the college or university campus here for a moment, just because that's the setting of a lot of this stuff. And I remember doing a faculty workshop at a large university and having lunch in the middle of this workshop with a table full, I think, 7 or 8, all men, as it happened at this particular lunch time. And somehow they got to talking about the fact that they had gone to college intending to be X. They had failed at X, and that led them to Y, which opened up doors that they were still walking through today in professions with which most of them were very well satisfied. And so I heard story after story about how a failure in organic chemistry, that's the classic story, led me away from medical education into 19th century French literature, you know. And I'm just as happy as a hog in mud teaching it today at University X. Story after story like that. And it was about time to go back to the workshop. And I said, well, before we leave, I'm leading this workshop. It's okay if you're late. What I want to know is how many of you have told this story to the students in your classes? And not a single hand went up. Not a single hand went up. And I said, oh, please tell them. Just give it a try, because you've got kids sitting in your classroom right now who came to this university with a goal at which they're being defeated. They need to know that defeat is not the end of the road. They need to know that failure is part of living life as an experiment, to put it in the terms that you and I are just talking about here, and that you can learn a lot from a failed experiment. In fact, you may learn more than from an experiment that succeeds. Any scientist can tell you that. So it seems to me that the dilemmas of the 20-somethings have to be held in part by a profoundly hospitable adult community of truth tellers, not just about what's going on politically or what's going on ecologically or what's going on in the discipline, but about the path of life, the claims of life, the way life pans out for most people, which has a lot of unpredictability to it, as far as I can tell. Certainly it has for me.
So I want to pull this apart a little bit more, because I think, like a lot of university faculty, educators in general, I was very shaped by your 1997 Courage to Teach. And it was given to me when I was an assistant professor at Duke by a dear colleague. And like so many people, this notion of the identity and the integrity of the instructor and the teacher being so important to the learning process. In this effort through Virtues and Vocations, we're trying to think about how to cultivate virtue in students so that once they're in a new environment, they have a set of tools and skills that help them navigate through these moments of challenge, these failures, these experiments, if you will. For you, what are there critical things beyond the kind of person we bring to the classroom as an educator that we need to be doing a better job with students in terms of cultivating certain ways of being and doing in the world?
Well, again, Suzanne, let me hedge this by saying that my experience with undergraduate age students is now several years old, and things change very rapidly in that generational environment, I know, but I think there are some constants as well. So one way of answering your question, or one piece of the puzzle, is I think we need to expose students to more real life situations of human beings at work facing the dilemmas that come with being a human being at work. Um, the young people these days have maybe had some kinds of work experiences, but none of them have, for example, had the kind of experience that a physician I talked to a few weeks ago has had. The conversation that he launched with me was about the fact that he works in a healthcare system that, to quote him, has him right on the edge of violating his Hippocratic oath 2 or 3 times a week. Now, if there was ever a situation where virtue was involved, virtue and vocation, I guess that would be a pretty classic example, pretty close to the heart. And there's no work role in the world that I can think of that doesn't have its equivalent to that moment of wondering whether you're going to slip down the slope, the slippery slope, and violate your Hippocratic oath. Teachers have a silent oath, at least good teachers do, to students in our K through 12 system. But think for a moment about what they're required to do to measure up to the political metrics that make their enterprise viable, that make their careers viable. I reckon that there's a lot of stuff you'd have to violate in order to serve students well. I can't imagine being a teacher in Florida, for example, and not being able to teach the truth about race in the United States, not being able to raise issues of personal sexual orientation and gender identity, um, and not feel I'm doing my students a profound disservice by leaving out this dimension of their education, of their growth as human beings. So to sit with someone like the doctor, as I did, and I don't think you'd have to look very far to find healthcare professionals who are in very similar situations in this country right now, is to have your eyes open and your heart opened, as well as your mind opened to some of the realities that you're going to have to deal with as you move ahead in life. And if it doesn't have to be teaching or medicine, it can be all kinds of situations, including being a partner in a marriage or relationship, a lasting relationship, or a parent of children. Um, these the virtues get called upon uh, all the time, and there, in a way, I'm recommending the old case study method, but let's make the case as real as possible by bringing in a person who's wrestling with this issue in real time and giving students an opportunity to be in dialogue with the real thing.
I think that's a super helpful reflection. I think, especially as it relates to our work here at Virtues and Vocations. So, one of the spaces we look at is in health education. So, um, pre med, medical, residency education. And nationally, there's this huge burnout that's happening amongst physicians. And they consistently describe precisely that tension you're describing. This the values and the work themselves are in constant tension.
Yeah.
Uh, it, is that a is that a moment where the discernment process is leading people out in a way it should be? So people are finding their life is telling them this is not the right work, or is it something perhaps about the nature of the education that we need, as you're saying, to give people a more practical, lived, experiential sense of what the work is so that they can be prepared for that tension? Or is this a moment where your life is speaking to you? And I know you can't generalize, but if you could kind of address that tension, that might be helpful.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done within formal education itself. But, you know, without, well, I was it was tempting to say without a lot of work, but I know it can be a lot of work to swim upstream against an academic culture that doesn't want to deal with emotions, that doesn't want to deal with subjective stuff generally, in favor of some what I regard as myth of objectivity, about a mistaken notion of how we come to objectivity. That's something that I wrote about in The Courage to Teach. And for me, it's a very important anchor to the argument that in service to some kind of mythical version of objectivism, we factor out all the subjective stuff that people are going to have to deal with for the rest of their lives. I mean, subjectivity isn't a flaw. It's part of the formula of being human. That's been a big point, obviously, among feminist scholars that I think we should all take seriously because it goes right to the heart of the educational enterprise. As you were speaking, Suzanne, I was thinking of the fact that you can go through the entire course of medical education, residency included, become a practicing MD, and never have had an opportunity to reflect on the daily experience that many doctors have of death, of losing a patient who has been in your care. That has a huge impact on the healthcare professional. And yet, nobody's giving them a chance en route to that role to understand how to hold, both personally and in community with other professionals, how to hold the brute experience of death and all of the ways it can extract a price from you, a price that only grows as you leave it unreflected upon, right? And so there's a lot that can be done. Another piece is, and I think this is true in all professional education, we need to be teaching our students about what's classically been called agency. That is, the capacity of every human being to do something about the situation they're in. I'll flip back to this doctor that I was talking to a couple weeks ago. I had a prior experience with a similar doctor several years ago in a physician retreat that I led. And I learned that in the aftermath of that retreat, where this doctor got in close touch with the slippery slope he was on in his healthcare system, always on the edge of violating the Hippocratic Oath, he got in touch with that personally. And at the retreat, he learned that 25 other MDs were as concerned about this as he was. Empowered by that experience, he went back to his healthcare system, his hospital, and he exercised agency. I don't know where it came from in his life, but I do know that it wasn't given to him in medical school. What he did with his agency was to basically function as a community organizer, which is, to me, a teachable skill. Having been one, I know you can learn how to be one. And what he did in his hospital was to gather a few other physicians who shared his concern. They studied the situation. They asked themselves, what kind of institutional reform might address this problem, at least in part, right? You don't try to reform the whole institution overnight, but at least in part. And they came up with the notion that they could work to establish a penalty-free zone for the reporting of medical errors. That would be a big deal because medical errors, which make hospitalization one of the leading causes of death in this country, will be reduced if professionals know that an understandable medical error can be reported to a central system without them losing their jobs. Now, I'm not talking about medical errors that happen because somebody's drunk or just flat out careless. But there are understandable medical errors that can be corrected by systemic changes. And so this team of doctors acting as agents, exercising their agency as community organizers, persuaded the administration to do this thing. And things became measurably better, in part because people started realizing I'm not a victim of this institution. I don't have to deal with the status quo, especially when it strikes right at the heart of my professional ethics, my professional commitments. And so I think another thing we need to be teaching in at various levels of education is this sense of agency. Liberate people from this notion that we are somehow the puppets of complex institutional structures. I mean, I understand where that's coming from. I have sometimes felt like a puppet myself, but I have yet to be in a situation where there's not something that could be done short of just leaving the situation, where there's not some sort of institutional reform or transformation that couldn't happen if we put our minds and hearts to it.
That's great. So I want to turn briefly to some of the questions that have been teeing up, if you don't mind. And so
Sure, that'd be great.
the first one is, you mentioned that you reached a point where you felt like you needed to heed your calling, or that you would be going down a road that would not help you grow as a person. Do you think it's ever too late to heed a call, or do some just not respond to a call until later in life?
I don't think it's ever too late. I really don't. I have at age 85, I collect old people stories, right? And 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 they, they talk to me because they they think, oh, maybe he will understand. And there are so many stories of people who literally in the last months of their lives found a different way to orient toward reality, toward their life experience, which they often will characterize by with the word gratitude. A new sense of gratitude came over me, and that's what I'm checking out with, and it has changed everything. Robert Frost was once asked, and I love this story. He was once asked, "Mr. Frost, do you have hope for the future?" And he said, "Oh, yes." He said, "I even have hope for the past." That, that, that there's a way to understand it that will turn out to be better than it seemed at the time. And I think that that's possible without self-delusion. Um, so yeah, I do. I think that yes, there are. In a way, I got lucky. I can't explain why. That at age 29, I felt able to pursue something that I really didn't understand, except that I couldn't not do it. The soul language about not wanting to defy my soul's imperatives, that came later. That wasn't with me at age 29. That wasn't how I was experiencing life or looking at the world. But I think that's a fair way of naming it. So it comes to some people later, it comes to some people very late, but I do believe on the basis of the stories I've heard that it can be transformational.
Great, thank you. The next one, Parker. I want you to know that I give your book, Let Your Life Speak, to every college graduate I encounter. It's such an important, affirming book about vocation and calling. I wonder if you could speak more about the inner teacher and cultivating a relationship with that aspect of oneself as a critical exercise in getting clear about one's vocation.
Well, thank you for those kind words, and thanks for helping to buy my oatmeal this morning. I appreciate it. For me, the inner teacher is a core belief, and it comes partly from my journey with Quakerism, which began when I was 35. It's a big, and goes on to this day. It's a big concept at the heart of the Quaker understanding of life, that each of us has an inner teacher, and that it's the most important teacher we have. Once we understand that we need communal discernment to sort and sift which inner voice we're listening to, because we have more than one. I think it's rooted in a much broader Christian concept, a long-time Christian concept, that every human being is created in the image of God. I think there are all kinds of ways to say that, and different traditions have different ways. I mean, the Hasidic Jews talk about the spark of the divine in everything, including human beings. Thomas Merton talked about true self. On and on it goes. I don't think there's a tradition that doesn't in some way name this mystery, this being at the heart of human being. I've always said that what you name it doesn't matter to me, but that you name it something I think is important, because if it's not named, it will go unrecognized, unattended, and obviously unfollowed. And it comes to some people in bodily ways. I think this dialogue with the inner teacher, this discernment. I've known people, and I was one of these people at one time, who showed up for a job that looked, just right, and found themselves sick to their stomach every time they had to go in. The body speaks about things that aren't necessarily organic, but that are about ways in which what we're doing with our life does not dovetail with true self. That we're living the life we think we want to live, but we're not living the life that wants to live in us. That's one way I characterized it in Let Your Life Speak. For me, the evidence for this in my own life, and I can't prove it to anyone else, has come from sitting in silence and trying to still my mind as best I can. Mindfulness, of course, is a big movement these days, and it has a lot, I think, to commend it. It has, for me, mostly to do with dialing down the intellect, which always wants to be in charge, and the ego, which always wants to be in charge, and even the emotions that always want to be in charge, my anger, for example, and returning to some more, primitive elemental source of guidance from within. And for me, that happens more in silence, the silence that I can come to when I'm not writing, even. I just doing, nothing except trying to be present to myself, and then always to have access to a community and of discernment. And that, a community, I should have mentioned earlier, doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to be 25 people or 100 living together like we did at Pendle Hill. It could be 2 or 3 people with whom you have a deeply trusting relationship, who are willing to follow these rules of discernment about no fixing, no saving, no advising, and no correcting each other, and ask honest, open questions, which is, incidentally, is a discipline or a skill in itself. My classic example is, have you thought about seeing a therapist? Is not an honest, open question. It's a little speech in disguise. which a lot of us are sort of skilled at getting away with, but we should drop that habit and just learn to inquire more purely in a way that allows that person to have a deepening conversation with themselves.
Great. Next one. You mentioned your joy and struggles with writing. How did you first become interested in writing?
That's a great question. Well, my parents, even both of them were high school grads, but my mother especially loved wordplay, and that may have been a big part of it. I got fascinated with wordplay early on, and became very fond of puns and Scrabble and stuff like that, and eventually poetry, both writing it and reading it. But I think existentially, the push to write, yeah, I'm quite sure of this. The push to write probably grew as I started journaling about the struggles I was having in life. One thing we haven't touched on in this conversation, maybe a topic for another time, is depression. And my 3 experiences of profound depression in the course of my adult life, which I've written about and spoken about a lot because a lot of people suffer this way, or they live with someone who suffers this way. And um, so I'd like to use my experience to be of some service to them. It's also therapeutic for me to show up in the world as I really am, and not some imaginary version of myself. So, you know, that sorting out early signs of depression when I was in my 20s became something that I was able to do in my journal at a time in life when I was too embarrassed by it or dumbfounded by it to do what I wish I had done, which is to talk to somebody else who knows how to hold that experience, maybe a therapist, maybe a teacher, maybe a good friend. But I kept it inwardly, and of course, it easily gets distorted when you don't have that paradoxical balance of relationship to work it through. I think that's maybe where it started.
Do you think, just a follow-up on that, you've talked about a community of discernment. Um, for folks who've experienced depression, how does a community of discernment help one perhaps navigate that? Did you find that community as a resource even during sort of moments of clinical depression?
The honest answer is no. It was depression is the kind that I had, and depressions are different. These were kind of deep episodic rather than chronic, but they would last 8, 9 months at a time. At the time, I would need medication to put a floor under myself. Eventually was able to get off medication each time. But for me, depression was this radically isolating experience where you feel utterly worthless, utterly unable to conduct business in the world. I had to avoid people. I couldn't sit in a clearness committee or any other form of community. It was about sweating it out 24/7. I used to say depression was like being lost in the dark, but that's not quite it. It's more like becoming the dark. If you're lost in the dark, there's a difference between you and the darkness, and you can negotiate that difference. You can walk in there, you can feel around for a window or a door or a little opening of some sort, maybe a little light. If you've become the dark, there's no negotiating anything. There's no difference between you and the dark. And but it's a topic for another time, a huge topic,
Yep.
and be glad to talk about it
Yeah.
if
Most
occasion arises.
I appreciate that. So as sort of pivot to a hopeful moment, as you think over sort of you look to the future, what are you most hopeful about?
I'm hopeful about the transcendence of the human spirit. Um, there's a lot to be discouraged about these days. I understand that. Um, I try to live free of the polls, the political polls that say this and that, quite unreliably, I believe, and stay much closer to my experience of myself, the folks I know well, what's going on in my own neighborhood, in my own community, where I see people, you know, doing life-giving things and contributing to life in all kinds of ways, that fill me with hope. And then as part of my understanding of hope, I've never understood hope as merely an attitude. I understand it as an action connected to a sense of possibility. And so when I find life-giving things going on among the people that I just named, or on a national scale, I try to support that and contribute to that in whatever way I can. And of course, I can't do a lot of that because I think part of being a grown-up is to realize that while you have unrealized potentials and you should be stretching for them, you also have limits, um, beyond which you don't want to go, because both you and the people in your life will pay a price if you do. Um, I think some of my depressions were about trying to exceed the limits because I didn't believe in limits, but now I do, and I think that's part of the deal. Um,
Wonderful. That's a great note to end on. And so I just want to thank you so much for spending time with us at this lunch hour. It was a real treat to have this conversation with you. I just, yeah, so very much enjoyed it. So
well,
thank you.
I enjoyed it a lot, Suzanne. Thank you so much for having me, and blessings to all.
Yep. And on May 13th, if folks are interested in joining us, it will be a conversation on purpose with former Bates College President Clayton Spencer and current Belmont University President Greg Jones. Thank you again, Parker. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.